Hello, chuirde agus fáte géisteach chuige a grán ihre dahad de bhlúirí bhéileis an putgréile tíocht goh ó cnúsach for the Desaran Cláis na Hoscoile Blá Clia. Hello and welcome to episode 40 of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin. Now, it would be remiss of me not to commence this episode of the podcast without long, drawn-out and generally grovelling apologies concerning the absence of signs of life regarding the series over the last year and a half. The good news is that the NFC still exists, the work continues apace, and the bad news? There is no bad news really, just that the last year and a half held plenty of challenges for me, and so we're left with the reality of one man's less than perfect attempts at keeping a variety of plates spinning. So forgive me please. Now, for the last 39 episodes of the podcast, we've generally explored a set topic or theme. We look at a particular aspect of folk tradition from a variety of angles, sources and perspectives using manuscript, sound archive and printed materials. In episode 1, we asked what is folklore, and now I want to stop, look back, survey our journey so far and ask, well, what is a folklore archive? Over the course of the next hour or so, we'll trace the origins and developments of archives in general through history, and then taking a look at the development of the form of the folklore archive, more specifically internationally and then in Ireland. And throughout this episode, we'll hear from the visionary and far-sighted individuals who were instrumental in establishing the archive known today as the National Folklore Collection. And this episode is also a sort of personal response to the folklore archive as it's impacted me in my own life. I never quite recovered after I first stumbled through the doors of the Department of Irish Folklore, as the National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin was then known. This was sometime around 2006, and I was then a bewildered 20-something-year-old at the tail end of a degree in philosophy and English literature, who, figuring myself not quite redundant enough, had decided to commence postgraduate studies in Irish folklore. My initial visit to the NFC was spurred on by a reawakening of my interest in the Irish language, as well as a burgeoning fascination at that time with traditional song and balladry. But my interest in these topics was further piqued by the realization that for the last few hundred years, a host of eccentric characters had travelled the length and breadth of Ireland, collecting fragments of traditional songs, stories and customs, and tabulating and classifying their findings in these strange and intriguing catalogues and indices. And I wanted to know more. Entering the department was like stepping into another world. On signing the heavy ledger and entering through the locked doors of the lobby, one passed down a long hall adorned with beautiful 19th century oil paintings. Left and right of the hall were the offices for staff, each of which was crammed floor to ceiling with old books and papers. The sound archive contained strange audio equipment and artifacts of all sorts. There were spring-wound wax cylinder machines, magnetic wire recorders, turntables, reel-to-reel tape decks, and all manner of audio odds and ends. The archive reading room was dominated by an array of metal cabinets running along the wall, which contained a subject index card catalogue whose headings bore a host of esoteric titles like Signs and Omens, Return of the Dead, Wild Animals and Birds, or The Other World. The archival strong room was filled with thousands upon thousands of beautifully handwritten, leather-bound manuscripts, all clad in a dark green colour, and all of which fell under the watchful care and protection of a large St. Bridget's cross, ornately woven from rushes and fixed to the roof in the centre of the room. The NFC library was filled top to bottom and shelf to shelf with rare books stacked on beautiful 18th century bookcases and less beautiful but still cool rolling shelving. Portraits of well-dressed folklore collectors and the informants from whom they recorded decorated the walls. Pictures of interviews being carried out in fields, hillsides, mountains, or by the seashore were scattered throughout the space. The maps, prints, photography, pamphlets, cabinets, files, books, manuscripts, things. The space itself evoked a wonderful atmosphere and a very particular emotional resonance, which was for me at once deeply familiar and at the same time strange and unknown. Here were recorded the words, voices and faces of our forebears, all bound together in a stunning tapestry of strange threads in which the past was made present by the staff and students who pored over the collections there at the archive. The classes I attended as part of my studies there changed my view of the world quite entirely. So everything about the folklore archive seemed to me to belong to another time, and in a way it did. Staring at the window on my 90-minute bus journey home from studies at the university always gave me plenty of time to reflect on the special atmosphere that permeated the archive, and more specifically on the strange collections which dwelt there. The more time that I spent inside the archive, the more that Ireland outside the archive began to change for me. Slowly, the edges of a mosaic of cultural expression spanning the country over began to be revealed. Now, some 18 years after first walking through the doors of the Department of Irish Folklore, and following on from many years of temporary research projects, intermittent teaching work and studies, all interspersed with hearty bouts of unemployment, I might add, I today find myself in the privileged position of working at the NFC and now inhabiting one of those aforementioned staff offices crammed floor to ceiling with books. The road has been long and not without its own twists and turns. But in my wanderings through this place, I've always been sustained by my sense of the significance and importance of the collections housed here, as a sort of tabernacle containing the inner life of the Irish people, and as a resource with great potential for us, and indeed a great many peoples, both at home and abroad. The collections here have a source of potential for us in fostering communal senses of belonging, inspiration, pride, history, destiny, optimism, joy, connection, and meaning among the public. But bearing all of this in mind, aside from old things, from books and manuscripts and strange audio formats, one might usefully ask, what is a folklore archive? Folklore archives are repositories which collect, preserve, describe and make available expressions of traditional knowledge and oral cultural heritage across a wide range of formats in media. In documenting traditional customs and memories, folklore archives have tended to develop on the margins of the formal archival world. Folklore archives offer unique cases for research as the systems of arrangement and description and classification that they employ in order to intellectually control their collections, along with the impulses that motivate them, they pose questions regarding the relevance of formal archival ideas and theories, especially when applied to grassroots, cultural or community contexts, which tend more to convey the significance of their collections through an emphasis on meaning and identity, as opposed to purely administrative, bureaucratic, evidential, transactional types of records. In order to understand the folklore archive as a specific archival form, we would do well to indulge in a whistle-stop tour of historical perspective concerning archives more generally. In Europe, early archival repositories storing records of a primarily legal and economic character, such as charters, deeds, wills, and the likes, emerged out of the feudal system with the establishment of local and national political administrations. These repositories were centralized and concentrated into forms prefiguring modern national archives by around the 16th century, and, housing the administrative records of the state, were accessible only to a select few researchers or chosen officials. Now, the turmoil and upheaval of the 1789 French Revolution brought dramatic change to the role of the archive, along with everything else might be added. And in the wake of the strife of the French Revolution, the preservation of, and perhaps more importantly, access to archival records came to be viewed as a duty of the state towards its citizenry, as a way to keep government power in check. And public access to those archival records came to be seen as an essential component in the protection of civic rights. Further transition in the role of archives followed in response to the enormous political upheavals at this time. And as the archives of defunct regimes and reformed or otherwise overthrown institutions lost their purely legal and administrative functions, they became spaces whose documents and records offered researchers evidence of historical data, a sort of window into the past, as it were. Now, the 18th century also saw the emergence of Romantic nationalist thought, which looked not to the official, bureaucratic, administrative records of the state for historical insight, but to so-called survivals from a past which served as a communal source of strength and inspiration, and which could be collected through an empirical and scientific method. For Romantic nationalist thinkers such as Johann Gottfried Herder, who was alive from 1744 to 1803, the genius or national soul of the Volk or the people was contained not in the official records of the state, but in the people's folk poetry. This is a body of tradition which he called the, quote, archives of a nationality, and, quote, the living voice of the nationalities. These legends, folktales, poems, proverbs, songs, and other oral literary forms were seen as fragments which, being gathered together, might be used to reconstruct a common European past and inheritance. Here's the former director of the Department of Irish Folklore, Professor Almqvist, talking on this topic.
Now, this is something that no folklorist would ascribe to nowadays, but nevertheless it became enormously important, because just then, as you can find the form that gives the key to the Indo-European form of a word in an obscure dialect or in a remote area, it might very well be that a particular tale or a particular version of a tale might give the clue to the reconstruction of this Indo-European myth. And they thought then of the folk tales as fragments of the old myths. And that meant that it wouldn't be considered enough to have one version of a tale, but collecting was wide. Many versions of one the same tale was collected, and tales from all areas. Though folklore certainly is something that has to do with nationalism and the own country, it became, thanks to the Grimm brothers, very early a comparative study, a comparative type of scholarship.
So these perspectives of Romantic nationalists at large developed in diametric opposition to the principles of formal archival science, a product of Enlightenment thought which focused on the articulation of standards and methodologies for the arrangement and description of archives, which were understood as being purely official in nature. This distinction between the unofficial and the official is very important for us. If you think of it, expressions of folklore are generally anonymous, not so much anonymous in the sense that we don't know who introduced us to a custom or taught us a song or such, but that the author of that particular custom, practice or song is generally anonymous, unlike the author of our favourite book, who we know because his name is on the side of the book, or the painter who signs his painting, and so on and so on. Expressions of folklore, the authors of these customs and practices are generally anonymous. They're also informal, communal, as opposed to being purely individualistic. They're also traditional, oral, and formulaic. Whereas formal archival records are generally not anonymous. They're identified. They're not informal. They're official. They're not communal. They're individual. They're not oral. They're written. And they're not formulaic. They're original. So folklore archives essentially consist of those records which were historically precluded from ever finding their way into an archival context in the first place. They are precisely that stuff which was not archival. Now, in opposition to the world of folklore and of Romantic nationalist impulses, the Manual for the Arrangement and Description of Archives, a book published in 1898 by Dutch archivists, was a foundational text for modern archival science, and it defined archival collections in the following way, quote, "The whole of the written documents, drawings and printed matter officially received or produced by an administrative body or one of its officials, insofar as these documents were intended to remain in the custody of that body or of that official." This definition bears little resemblance to concepts underpinning folklore archives, and indeed the approach outlined in the Dutch Manual, while understandable and necessary as an approach to formal and state archives, was alien to those who, following the intellectual trajectories of Romantic nationalist thought, wished to preserve precisely that information which was, by virtue of its unofficial nature, entirely absent from the official record and therefore archives, namely the informal oral traditions of the rural peasantry. Core principles arising in the context of the Dutch Manual were those of provenance, or respect des fonds, which dictated that archival records received from different origins must be kept separately and organized in the sequence established by their creators. Under this approach, records deposited in the archive from corporate bodies or state departments were seen as representing a sort of natural residue left behind by administrative processes and official transactions, a pristine, organic whole which revealed the context and intention of its creators. These records, being kept by the archivist in their original order, were understood as presenting a doorway into the past as it actually was. Expanding on these principles and hugely influenced by the Dutch Manual was A Manual of Archive Administration by Charles Hilary Jenkinson, who was alive from 1882 and who died in 1961. Jenkinson's text, first published in England in 1922, is among the most influential treatises on archival theory and practice in the English language, and it proposed that the archivist should act as an impartial and dispassionate custodian of archives, which were understood as having reached their final arrangement by a natural process, and, quote, not because someone brought them together with the idea that they would be useful to students of the future, or to prove a point or illustrate a theory. As such, Jenkinson was completely opposed to the idea that archives should ever collect their own records, stating that he wished the word collection would be banished from the archivist's vocabulary. This is a very important point for us, for folklore archives, being concerned with information that doesn't exist in any formal or official capacity, generate their own records through fieldwork and through collecting specifically, through direct interviews, questionnaires, fieldwork of varying sorts, sketches, maps, photography, and so on and so on and so on. These outlines are, of course, a simplification, but they serve to illustrate an important point, that folklore archives and formal archives in many ways might usefully be imagined as two parallel lines of a train track running through history, having set off from a common origin, but which never overlap or cross.
To the Victorians, the folk meant the common people, and lore was less than learning. So instead of saying the people's intellectual achievement, you said the trivial achievement of the lower classes, folklore, in other words. You see, our subject, which we nowadays call ethnology, deals with the past of the ordinary man, in whom history wasn't interested until very, very recently.
So, if you haven't dozed off, what does all this have to do with the archival landscape in Ireland? Well, Ireland has a somewhat troubled relationship with archives and with its own archival inheritance. Indeed, we blew up the National Archives at the outset of the Irish Civil War. On the 30th of June 1922, the Public Records Office of Ireland, which housed the records of administration in Ireland from the 13th to the 19th centuries, was destroyed in an enormous explosion that marked the outset of the Irish Civil War. As a note to any listeners who are unaware of what I'm describing, I recommend that you go to an amazing site, virtualtreasury.ie, and there's a really cool article there from January 2018 called Construction Destruction, the Public Record Office of Ireland, 1867 to 1922. And I'd also suggest anyone interested in this read the memoir by Ernie Malley, The Singing Flame, which is an amazing first-hand account of his experiences during the Irish Civil War. So a few things for people to check out, but I'll leave the links below. Anyway, where were we? The Public Records Office of Ireland was seized by anti-treaty forces in April 22, and it was converted into a munitions factory in which mines and grenades were cast and filled with explosives and detonators piled between the racks upon which Ireland's public records were stored. What could possibly go wrong, I hear you ask? Well, on Saturday the 28th of June, some 2.5 months after the archive's initial seizure by anti-treaty Republicans, pro-treaty government forces bombarded the forecourts with heavy artillery, borrowed, ironically enough, from the British Army. And on the afternoon of Friday the 30th of June, 2 heavy mines located in the basement of the Records Treasury adjacent to the Public Records Office exploded. The enormous blast reduced the building to a shell, and the conflagration that ensued destroyed the great bulk of Ireland's administrative, legislative, ecclesiastical and genealogical records, fragments of which were swept high into the air over Dublin before falling on the suburbs for miles around as charred and ashen scraps. Imagine burnt fragments of manuscript pages landing in your garden. Seán Ó Súilleabháin.
I want to play a recording now of Cormac O'Malley, the son of Ernie Malley, as he narrates from his father's memoir a piece describing the destruction of the Public Records Office from someone who was there. So this is Cormac O'Malley reading from his father's memoir, The Singing Flame, and my thanks to Cormac for permission to use this recording in the episode.
Small explosions began around the yard. We threw ourselves on the ground. There was another great explosion, but I did not think it so severe as the first shock. Again, masonry was hurled through the windows and around the yards. Dust whirled in the corridor. We leaned against the walls. They swayed to and fro. There was a strange buzzing in my ears. Shattering explosions fell into our room and burst. The noise seemed to shatter my eardrums. We threw ourselves on the ground while splinters went around the walls. I held my hands to my ears and my body shook. My nerves began to twitch. My mouth was filled with grit. The bursting noise seemed to thud and re-thud against my ears.
The self-inflicted destruction of so many historical documents at the birth of the Irish Free State created an archival landscape akin to that of what Herbert Wood, who was the keeper of the Public Records Office at the time, described as a new country almost without a history, setting the stage for what Dudley Edwards, the historian, described as an archival tundra at state level, which was to last in Ireland for nearly 50 years. And while historians and antiquarians lamented the loss of Ireland's public records in the aftermath of the Civil War, public thinking in the country seems to have been dominated by the opinion that the destruction of these records represented the loss of a sort of administrative debris of British rule in Ireland and could therefore be regarded lightly. So, if public thinking in the country seems to have been dominated by the opinion that the destruction of these records, of the destruction of the National Archives, the destruction of Ireland's Public Records Office, could be regarded lightly, well then, why was that the case? Where was Ireland's cultural inheritance to be found exactly? And to answer that question, we need to travel back through the plumes of smoke rising over Dublin in 1922 and return to late 19th century Ireland, to the period known as the Gaelic Revival, which saw the renewal of interest in the Irish language and Irish Gaelic culture, folklore, popular customs, songs, poetry, mythology, sports, traditional music, dance, arts, etc., etc. In Ireland, the Gaelic Revival heralded a period in which the traditions of the peasantry were seen as a potential source for the regeneration of society against a backdrop of cultural artificiality and decay. And perhaps more importantly, given the context we've just described concerning Ireland's Public Records Office and within the context of the fight for independence, the valorisation of folk culture served as a means through which an intellectual elite could assert new forms of national identity in opposition to colonial hegemony. In a seminal address to members of the Irish National Literary Society in 1892, the Irish language scholar, folklorist and the first president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, Douglas Hyde and Craveen even, he was born in 1860 and he died in 1949, he appealed for the cultivation in Ireland of everything that is most racial, most smacking of the soil, most Gaelic and most Irish. Hyde later lamented that Ireland's oral literature, folktales, legends and so on, had been trampled in the common ruin under the feet of the zeitgeist by the same, quote, waves of materialism and civilization which had subsumed the oral traditions of European countries elsewhere. Hyde's views and the views of many active in Ireland's Gaelic revival harken back to the impulses and the feelings that we mentioned at the outset of this episode, those which arose in the 18th century, namely the romantic nationalist impulses of those who asserted that the national soul of the people was not contained in the official records of the state, but in the traditions and customs of the people, the archives of the nationality. Here is a short quote or short piece of Professor Séamas Ó Catháin, and he's outlining and describing the various ways in which different streams of revivalist thought all converge in the figure of Hyde and how important he was.
All streams of interest in Irish folklore seemed to converge in his person. He was friendly with the writers like Lady Gregory, Yeats and Synge. He was himself a playwright and a poet. He was a friend of Celtic scholars like Nutt and of collectors like William Larmony. He linked the scientific collection of Irish folk tales and folk poetry directly to the renewal of the Irish language. His Beside the Fire was published in 1890. It was a collection, as it says in its title, also of Irish Gaelic folk stories. Hyde was a collector. He was also a translator and he was also a commentator.
Now, in 1909, Douglas Hyde was appointed the first chair of modern Irish at UCD, University College Dublin, and writing in the preface to his publication Beside the Fire, a collection of folk tales translated from Irish, Hyde declared that the old stories which had been swallowed by, quote, waves of materialism and civilization in other countries had until recent times remained, quote, unengulfed on the western coasts of Ireland, though had now fallen into a state of anachronistic decline, dying on the hillsides where they probably existed for thousands of years. It was Séamas Ó Delargy, James Hamilton Delargy, who was a young student and former assistant of Hyde's, who, full of the idealism of the Gaelic revival, would endeavour to secure for future generations the sources of inspiration and pride which had for so long languished in what he called the lumber room of history, precisely those tales, traditions and songs of Ireland he understood as representing, quote, the state papers of a forgotten and neglected people. To this end, Delargy sought the assistance of the newly independent Irish state to support the establishment of an archival programme which would result in the creation of the Irish Folklore Commission, later Department of Irish Folklore, and today National Folklore Collection, from which I now sit, incanting at you into a microphone. Earlier on, I mentioned Charles Jenkinson and his Manual of Archives Administration and the Dutch Manual, hugely influential and foundational guides for the administration of formal archives. The former, Jenkinson's Manual, was published in 1922, the same year that Ireland's National Archives went up in smoke. And this also, interestingly enough, was around the same time that a seed was planted in the mind of a young Delargy to do all that he could to collect and preserve Ireland's folklore, leading to the establishment of the Folklore Commission and a new archival form in Ireland, that of the Folklore Archive. So, while full of enthusiasm, Delargy, recognising that he had no one to help or guide him in the scientific methods of folklore collecting, immediately looked to scholars beyond Ireland's shores for assistance in establishing a framework through which the systematic collection and description of folkloric materials might occur. Delargy looked to scholars from abroad precisely because the Folklore Archive as a form had existed in other countries in Europe, in Scandinavia, in Sweden, Norway, in Finland, in Germany, and elsewhere, in quite a developed form from the 19th century on. And so those scholars knew that there was a gap, that if you don't understand Ireland, then you can't understand Europe. So they were keen to assist him. In January 1926, Delargy wrote to the archivist of the Norwegian Folklore Institute, Reidar Christiansen, whom he'd met by chance in the Dublin bookshop some years earlier.
There was a still younger man then from Antrim, James Hamilton Delargy, very much alive and interested, and he still remains for me not only as a link with another period, but as the firm evidence of the continuity of Irish aspirations and ideals. To a folklorist, he is connected with something that seems to be the greatest change to me of all. The change from some few manuscript collections in private possession to the Irish Folklore Commission, with its treasures of manuscript collection, the greatest and most important in Europe. Thus, by the work of the Commission, the ancient vanishing tradition, the ways of life, vanishing everywhere. But in Ireland they had remained long enough to make it possible to preserve every expression of this old culture. And not with any kind of nostalgic desire to revive, but gratefully accepting the fact that a true and faithfully record is in existence of the way the ancient people lived.
And in that letter, Delargy stated that, quote, a small number of people in Dublin are of a mind that it is high time to get together and to endeavour to collect, arrange, and if feasible, publish a journal dedicated to the study of Irish folklore. Now, Delargy recognised the lack of expertise among those interested in undertaking such an endeavour in Ireland, and he requested Christiansen's guidance on the methodology required to preserve those sort of fragments of the heritage which he feared would quickly disappear unless swift action was taken. Christiansen's replies, detailing the processes through which folkloric endeavours had been organised in Norway, were read to a small assembly which gathered in Dublin on the 13th of November 1926. The group, consisting of Douglas Hyde, Delargy and others involved in the Gaelic revival, were unified by their desire to found an organisation specifically dedicated to the collection and preservation of items of Irish folklore, and at a meeting in January 1927, Untitled Chapter, the Folklore of Ireland Society, was formally established.
Following the establishment of the Folklore of Ireland Society, Delargy went on an international trip where he went to Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and other countries, where he visited folklore scholars of those countries in order to get some assistance and advice in terms of how to approach the situation in Ireland. And this was a hugely influential and inspiring time for him. And I want to play a piece of audio here from a friend of Delargy's, the economist, diplomat, statesman, politician, T.K. Whitaker, Ken Whitaker, who I remember meeting once at a Folklore of Ireland Society lecture. And in this piece, Whitaker describes, or he recounts a piece of writing from Delargy, and this account gives Delargy's reflections or reminiscence or the sense of inspiration he felt on return from that trip, and describes his seeing Ireland coming into view as he went to the front of the boat as it came in to Dublin from Holyhead. So here you go.
On his way back from Sweden, where he had studied under Carl Wilhelm von Süder, and Finland, where he had spent some time, he said in his account of it to me, "In due course I found my way back to Ireland. On the way back, I remember this very well, I saw my old friend Robin Flower in London and gave him some account of my travels. This is a sentimental statement, and I'm not ashamed of it, because you can do something with sentiment if it is properly harnessed. I remember coming in on the mail boat from Holyhead. I went right out to the bow and I saw the Irish hills. That is a long time ago, 1928. And I said, the tradition of Ireland is behind those hills, and we've got to rescue it before it's trampled into the dirt. Because it was a jewel of great price, and one had to see that it was given a refuge and an appreciation by the Irish people. And then the trouble started.
The outlines of Ireland's folk traditions began to appear in a journal published by the Folklore of Ireland Society. And Delargy, the journal's editor, realising that the scope of the work that was in front of him was beyond what a voluntary organisation like the Society could adequately manage, approached the state in search of support and funding for an institute tasked with the collection and preservation of Irish folklore. To this end, and following on from the work of the Society, Institute Féile de Saorann, the Irish Folklore Institute, was established in 1930. By 1931, the Institute had recorded over 100 folk tales, along with a, quote, unique body of material illustrative of the social, economic and cultural life of the Irish peasantry. And this was seen to represent the, quote, largest manuscript collection of the folklore of a Celtic country in existence.
A certain quantity of material came together. People began to collect material, or people began to dig about in their attics to find things which their parents, their grandparents, or somebody had written down from the oral tradition of the past. And a quantity of material of this kind came together, so that finally they prevailed upon the state to provide a small body called a small effort institution called the Folklore Institute, in order to take care of this material. That was in 1931, 32, and 3-4 years later in 1935. The state was further persuaded to set up what was known then as the Irish Folklore Commission, primarily established for 5 years with a certain financial support, whose task was to record and preserve traditional material.
The Institute, though, fell short of Delargy's expectations and aspirations, and so he approached Éamonn de Valera, then the President of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, with a view to secure renewed support from the government for the collection and preservation of Ireland's folk traditions. Delargy's plea fell on sympathetic ears, and he came away from the meeting with a promise of £3,000 per annum to support a 5-year project which would be called the Irish Folklore Commission, and which was established in 1935. Tasked with the collection, collation and cataloguing of oral and written folklore, and with the editing and publication of such materials, the Commission would also provide access at reasonable times to its collected materials to students and scholars desiring to avail thereof for the purpose of study and or publication. With the establishment of the Irish Folklore Commission and the possibility of hiring full-time and part-time folklore collectors and cataloguers, the materials amassed by both the Society and the Institute would now be supplemented by collections made on an unprecedented scale. I'm going to play a quote here that we played in the first episode. It's a Delhi quote of Delargy as he recounts the night where he met with de Valera and where he got the go-ahead to create the Irish Folklore Commission.
But I remember very well through Senator Joseph Connolly, who came from the same part of Ireland as I did, and the Glencoe Antrim, and who arranged the matter. I had an interview with Mr. de Valera many years ago, to be exact, 1934. And it was the night of the budget, and officials were coming into him, into his room, and he was pushing them aside, and he talked about something. He talked about his youth. And when he was a boy, that he had heard folk tales told in English, of course, in County Limerick. And he went on talking, and then I couldn't, it was a tense moment for me, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I don't speak the language of diplomacy." Just one thing to say to you. The material is there, it's dying, and you know it. You're interested in the Irish language, as I am. And I think it's about time something was done to put on paper or to record in some way the old tradition of a silent people, who, as I said a moment ago, had so much to say. So please, take that pen in your hand and write, "Let it be done," and I'll do it, get other people to help me. And that's how the Folklore Commission started.
Now, the Folklore Commission was described in a 1935 government memorandum as representing a great national cultural movement in which the cooperation of the whole nation was being sought. And I have to thank my colleague here, Kate Manning, the Principal Archivist at UCD Archives, for her bringing the following government memorandum to my attention. It's stored among de Valera's papers, and it concerns the Irish Folklore Commission, and it notes the following. A Folklore Commission is being appointed by the Free State Government for the recording and transcription of Irish oral tradition and for the publication of selections of it. The Viceregal Lodge in the Phoenix Park, which has been the residence of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland for nearly 200 years, will be converted into a museum of Irish folklore and antiquities, and will contain provision for the housing of the folklore library of discs, cylinders, and transcripts and printed works. Full-time collectors using recording machines will travel throughout the country, taking down this oral tradition and making transcripts of it, which, with the records, they will send on to headquarters in Dublin. This is a fascinating little memorandum, partially because it says that we were meant to go and live in the Viceregal Lodge. Now, the Irish Folklore Commission was never installed in the palatial surrounds of the Viceregal Lodge, and it is nowadays, listeners might recognise it by its contemporary name, Áras Nuachtarán, the residence of the President of Ireland. And I doubt if I were to appear at the gates of the President's house waving a scrap of carbon paper from 1935 and citing the immutability of official records that he might hand over the keys, as it were, but there you go. Now, the Commission built on the groundwork laid by its forerunners and with the help of international scholars and with government support. And with that support and funding came an increase in collections that were submitted from full and part-time folklore collectors all over Ireland. But in order to organise information gathered from the field, in order to actually arrange the material that was coming in from these field workers, a system for the arrangement and description of folkloric archival materials had to be developed. And that system was developed by Seán Ó Súilleabháin. Seán Ó Súilleabháin, a hero of mine, he was born in 1903 and he passed away in 1996. And following his appointment as the Commission's archivist in 1935, he was sent to the Landsmålsarkivet, the Dialect and Folklore Archive at Uppsala in Sweden. And for 3 months, Ó Súilleabháin worked there each day. And here's a quote of his. He says how he worked, quote, "Under the guidance of Dr. Oka Campbell and Fröken Ella Ustedt, by degrees I became familiar with the system of classification in use there. A detailed scheme for the classification of folklore material had been prepared in Sweden in 1934 by Professor Herman Geyer, Dr. Oka Campbell and Dr. Sven Lilleblad, and a slightly modified version of it was in everyday use at the archive at Uppsala. It was a subject index, and every item of traditional information which could be construed as folklore came within its ample scope." I'm going to play a piece of audio now of Seán Ó Súilleabháin, and in this clip it's from a film that we have in the archive. It's maybe 2 or 3 hours worth of film trawled through. It was taken over 2 days, and it's Professor Séamas Ó Catháin and Professor Almqvist, the former directors of the Department of Irish Folklore, and they're interviewing Seán about everything that he can remember about the Folklore Commission. They're basically grilling him in a lovely environment, sitting amongst lovely books for a couple of days. And they're just going back from the start, and he's telling the whole story about his life, how he met Delargy, everything. It's a fascinating video with fascinating insight. And the other thing that's fascinating about it is Seán's recall. His memory is just incredible. The detail and the stories he relates, but the detail that he can recount. In this clip, he's talking about it's just a brief description of his training in Sweden, but rather than have me reading it out, it's better to hear from the man himself. So, Shahuguf.
And it was all in Swedish, naturally, in the archive in Uppsala. And there was a very nice lady in charge under Campbell. She was called Ella Olsson. Later on, she changed her name to Ella Udsted. So she spoke English to me, taught me what the various sections did, and I copied out the main heading, about 12 main divisions, and then minor subsections, and then minor subsections, and then I come down to the details with different coloured cards at the head of each and so on. She taught me all that.
Now, writing to Delargy after his arrival in Sweden, Ó Súilleabháin explained that he was spending his time studying the various sections of the archive's cataloguing system, and that, as part of this study, he hoped to adapt it for use in Ireland. Material accessioned by the Folklore Archive at Uppsala was arranged under a series of subject headings. These were settlement and dwelling, trades and housekeeping, persons, nature, folk medicine, time and division of time, principles and rules of popular belief and custom. That, for the uninitiated listener, means superstitions. Mythological beings, historical traditions, and folk poetry. After 3 months in Uppsala, Ó Súilleabháin had, quote, mastered the cataloguing technique and was fairly conversant with the general working of the folklore department of the archive. Now, the Irish Folklore Commission, at this early stage, was in the habit of binding and cataloguing fieldwork notebooks returned by collectors in chronological sequence. On his return to Ireland, Ó Súilleabháin began to formalise a subject-based card catalogue in order to describe and control the material received by the Irish Folklore Commission from its fieldworkers. The system he devised corresponded closely to the model in use at Uppsala, but incorporated, quote, minor changes necessary to cope with the various types of traditions found in Ireland.
And, of course, material didn't start to come in any flood at all until we had 4 or 5 collectors going, because they had to be equipped with ediphones. I had to look after that, because they'd have to come up first to the office to learn how to use the ediphone. We bought the ediphones from Stewart's near Jury's Hotel there in College Green. Stewart, he was our agent. And then the wax cylinders, we bought them in dozens, in cardboard boxes. Cylinders, and they'd be put in and wound up and used, posted out through the post office at the bottom of Leeson Street. I'd have to take down the boxes there every evening for the 4 o'clock post, having cleared off what had been on them. You see, we couldn't afford to keep, though some ediphone cylinders were kept, but they were very expensive, you know.
Following the creation of an initial template, Ó Súilleabháin arranged the Commission's collections under 14 major subject headings. Under each major subject heading were grouped a series of minor headings, with a different hierarchical structure indicated in the catalogue by the use of cards of different colours. This is what we heard Seán mentioning in his piece earlier on, and which you still find in the subject index, that amazing index that's in the archive today. Under both major and minor subject headings were individual excerpt cards, upon which item-level descriptions summarising manuscript entries were written, together with page ranges and details concerning the area in which the material was collected. This subject-based card catalogue system allows researchers to access collections from a multitude of cross-referenced topics, being described by Ó Súilleabháin as the, quote, real key to the whole archive.
Now, they were lucky in obtaining the services of a certain Mr. Seán Ó Súilleabháin, whose name is widely known and widely revered all over the world wherever studies of this kind are in progress, because he codified for the first time in the English language in a work called A Handbook of Irish Folklore. He codified the definition of what folklore is and asked all the questions that are to be asked if one is interested in it, running to 700 pages or more. Mm-hmm. Now, as one knows, tradition, folk tradition, as defined by O'Sullivan, and indeed is defined by any person who is interested in ethnological survey and research, it is defined very, very widely indeed, because it's defined by the method of transmission in everything. Everything which is transmitted traditionally is tradition. Entirely apart or independent of whatever subject it may be, so that there isn't any aspect of human thought or of human endeavour, human speech, human action, which cannot be included in tradition insofar as it has been transmitted traditionally, so that it ranges very, very widely from the most humdrum thing, from house building and fire irons and ploughing fields, to the most metaphysical flights of belief and of custom and of magic and so on.
I want to play a piece of audio for a minute in which the former director of the Department of Irish Folklore, Professor Séamas Ó Catháin, can be heard sort of leafing through some of the fantastic subject index cards and reading out the titles, all of which read like slightly insane news headlines of a newspaper I wish existed.
There are basically four main indexes: the card index of collectors who recorded folklore, an index of informants from whom lore was recorded, an index of districts, and the most important of all, a subject card index.
Caused this whirlwind. This is from County Kilkenny. Whirl blast in meadow, hay fork inserted in it causes moan. Owner's cow falls into bog hole. Owner meets old man in house with bandaged eye. It was damaged in whirl blast. Cow returned, however, with one other, as owner gives successful cure to old man. This is from County Sligo. When the she guihe rises, one should throw a thraneen after it, turn 3 times around and say, "May all the bad luck of the year go along with you." It's unlucky to walk near where it rises, as one might get a blast. Cows or horses driven should be stopped in front of it. If let pass through it, they might get a blast. This is from County Laois. Unless a person turns his back to the she guihe, it will do him no harm. And this is from Cork, from Almqvist.
In some ways, the paintings in the department set the mood for the material. Daniel MacDonald's painting of the she ghee complements the manuscript information.
Now, with regard to the arrangement of folklore archives by systems of this sort, my friend and colleague Marina Chernyavska, the Ukrainian folklore and archives scholar, notes, quote, "The kind of questions that folklorists ask require folklore archivists to describe folklore collections by subject, in addition to their creators, which is the usual practice for libraries rather than archives. Since folklorists often study variation depending on locality, folklore material must be indexed with geographic terms. These provide more efficient access to folklore collections and improve their discoverability. So, while necessary for our purposes as folklorists and as folklore researchers, the use of subject headings problematizes several of the concepts and perspectives of formal archival practice. I'm asking you now to cast your mind back, if it's not too traumatizing, to the earlier section of this podcast where I was mentioning the Dutch manual and Jenkinson's manual, the sort of the manuals out of which the rules of sort of formal archival theory grew in a way in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And of the many rules laid down in the Dutch manual, for example, one of them states that, in the quote, "In the arrangement of an archival collection, the interests of historical research should receive only secondary consideration." And in Jenkinson's Manual of Archive Administration, he advises that archival records should never be arranged for, quote, the subject matter they contain, or for, quote, subject interests they may possess for modern students, in chronology, or even in the form in which they are cast. So in considering these divergent approaches to arrangement, the differing cataloguing systems of both formal and folklore archives might usefully be understood as representing idealized forms organized in accordance with their own internal logic, sorts of conceptual mirrors which reflect the particular visions of the world outside of the archive. Oka Campbell, who was alive from 1891 to 1957, a renowned Swedish folklorist who assisted in devising the subject-based system that was adapted by Súilleabháin, he noted the varying perspectives and visions that underpin archives. And at the mid-century folklore conference in Bloomington, Indiana, he says the following: I should like to point out some facts about archives in general, about how they have originated and developed. In different countries, their history has followed entirely different lines. In some countries, they have been established by government authority, and in some have been supported under the universities. Every archive is the development of an idea of some one pioneer in the field. In considering archives, it is always important to think of the fundamental urge that started the organization. Why did a particular archive start? What constitutes the principal point of its present-day development and aims, and what general plans are there for its future? Divergences between folklore archives and their formal counterparts do not end at questions of arrangement and description alone. While folklore archives contain a range of documents and record types also found in formal archives, the primary research materials that they contain are generated during fieldwork. According to the Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology, materials collected through fieldwork are differentiated from, quote, organic archives, being regarded instead as artificial collections, arranged for the convenience of description or retrieval rather than in an order originally established by the creator. In recent years, archival theorists contrasting the apparently artificial collections with apparently organic archives have suggested that ultimately any aggregation that results from conscious human action is an artificial creation. Others have been less accommodating. Concerning oral histories in particular, the archivist Lisa Klopfer noted the opinion among some archivists that oral histories are not really records and so do not belong in archives, and the Dutch archivist John van Albade criticised his colleagues for their openness to collecting, writing that, quote, archives are successively created, received, maintained and preserved. Archives are not collected, never ever. For years, collecting has been a fashion. If collectors start calling themselves archivists and real archivists put up with that, I consider that to be more than surprising. So, in rejecting the processes central to the folklore archive, formal archival theorists historically claimed to uphold the, quote, precious characteristic of impartiality that Jenkinson had espoused. Though far from being an unbiased agent, the Jenkinsonian archivist was always involved in the co-creation of the archive, tending historically to support the dominant narratives of the powerful record creators of the nation-state, while disprivileging oral histories and other records in a manner that was never as value-free as may have been claimed.
I want to play a clip now, a piece of audio, an interview with Delargy. And this interview was taken just towards the end of the Irish Folklore Commission, just before the commission became the Department of Irish Folklore at UCD, so before the commission was wound up and moved out to the premises here in the university. And in this interview, Delargy is asked, where did you get this material? Who did you get this from? And Delargy gives him, in his typical rhetorical style, a fine answer.
Now, you mentioned 100,000.
At least.
At least. From what kind of people were you able to gather these?
From your people and from my people. And they gave it for nothing. The ordinary people of Ireland are the people who must be remembered, and what they have to say, at least what has been recorded from, is only a tithe of what they had to say. Because they'd never been asked these questions before. And these questions cover all kinds of subjects, not only folk tales, not only local history, but, well, it's an El Dorado of the Western world, a hitherto unrecorded source for the historian of the future. And as I said to you, we have come to the end of the first chapter. but the book will contain many chapters. I won't live to see many of them.
So why do any of this? Why do we have a folklore archive? What's this for? Well, it seems to me that here in Ireland and further afield, there exists for many people today a crisis of meaning. Over recent generations, many of the cultural structures that underpinned and oriented our forebears have been eroded. Many of the well-worn reference points, the rites of passage, the spiritual traditions, the pastimes, the community observances, the calendar customs, the narratives, the trades and practices of the past have fallen by the wayside or been forgotten entirely. Of course, life moves on. Customs and cultures change. Customs and cultures have always changed. But modern life seems increasingly to be characterized by a spirit of atomization, by relativism, by discord, by fretfulness, by materialism, by consumerism, and by cultural amnesia. And it's on this cheery note that the positive role of the NFC and of the archival collections, which, well, many of which are portrayed in this podcast and which are stored at the NFC and presented online, that they should be emphasized. One might well ask what purpose this material serves in our lives, and how might we utilize these archival collections for their potential healing impacts, for example. The objects contained in our collections are intangible, but at the same time they're full of meaning. Collective memories cannot be held or touched as treasured keepsakes, but they can nonetheless be transmitted as communal forms of expression with shared associations. We use the past not out of mere nostalgia, but as a way to meaningfully navigate the complexities and anxieties of the present. Folklore serves as a mechanism of connection and can assist us to navigate and give expression to the humours, joys, sorrows and tragedies of life in a way that is meaningful, insightful and ultimately uplifting and consoling. Shared narratives and traditional customs give hope in times of despair. They soothe in times of sorrow and grief. They praise the newborn, they give courage to the weary, and they honour the dead. They orient and guide us on our way, reminding us that we are not alone and helping us to bear one another's burdens. Aching loneliness and outright nihilism follows in the wake of a future with no past, but the future's not what it used to be. The Folklore Archive is full of words and faces, and by coming to know our forebears, their dreams, their hopes, their beliefs, their customs, their struggles, their modes of living, their rituals and crafts, their stories and songs, their jokes and proverbs, we come to know ourselves. We recognize in our ancestors the voices of our mothers and fathers. As we look upon their faces, we see our own faces. As we listen to their voices, we find our own voices. In understanding their victories, failures, delights, and fears, we better understand ourselves. A respect for our own past amounts to an essential form of self-respect, increasing our sense of self and solidifying our place in the world. I hope you, dear listener, will please forgive me. It feels self-indulgent to talk in sort of terms such as this, but the underlying spirit that has ultimately animated and guided all of the work of the Folklore Archive is, in my view, dare I say it, love. Love for those who have gone before us, love for the beauty of the cultural inheritance which has been bequeathed to us, and love for those who will come after us. Our lives are built on the stories that we tell. So, in summary, many of the materials that are housed today at the NFC were gathered as a part of a national effort to preserve Ireland's folk traditions at a time when they were perceived as being in danger of disappearing without a trace. And when folklore collections began to be widely amassed in Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were viewed as potential sources of collective and national cultural regeneration. But by virtue of their defining characteristics, folk traditions were historically precluded from preservation in most archival contexts, which tended to favour the powerful record creators of the nation state over personal oral testimony. And unlike formal archives, which comprise official or transactional records, many of the materials housed today at the NFC were gathered as part of a national effort to preserve Ireland's folk traditions at a time when they were perceived as being in danger of disappearing without a trace. When folklore collections began to be widely amassed in Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were viewed as potential sources of collective and national cultural regeneration. But, by virtue of their defining characteristics, folk traditions were historically precluded from preservation in most archival contexts, which tended to favour the powerful record creators of the nation state over personal oral testimony. Unlike formal archives, which comprise official or transactional records, folklore archives are repositories of traditional knowledge consisting of collections gathered through fieldwork, which often fall outside of international standards for archival description. And the folklore archive might, in a certain approach at least, usefully be viewed as a sort of photo-negative to the formal archive, or as a sort of national community archive which places memory and identity at its core. Folklore collections, then, are not outdated curios forged in the half-light of ignorance or maintained by some misguided sentimentality, nor are they merely nostalgic snapshots of culture frozen in time. They're a rich and often a very messy source of imagination, inspiration and consolation, which we can today transmit and broadcast to a large audience and hopefully foster some sort of sense of community and belonging as part of that. So this podcast and these last 40 episodes, in a way, have been a tool to highlight the uplifting and sort of healing benefits of these traditional forms of knowledge, to illuminate, to educate, and a method for inspiring in others the sense of wonder and potential that I felt on first stepping through the doors of the NFC, which is a feeling that still possesses me as I walk that corridor today. Thank God. So here endeth my dirge. We'll be back in the new year with a new series of episodes and some interviews and so on that we're working on now.
I'd like to play a piece of audio here from the former director of the Department of Irish Folklore, Professor Almqvist, with what is a plea to the Irish people, in which he emphasises the importance of the work of the Folklore Archive.
And all that remains to be said is to wish you all a happy and healthy and peaceful Christmas. And thank you and God bless.
If I were to direct myself to the people of Ireland and this government, and if I were to plead our case without inhibitions or sly diplomacy, this is more or less what I would feel like saying. A winter Naherin. Do not neglect one of the greatest treasures you possess. I beseech you, for your own sake, for the sake of your men and women, for the sake of past generations, all the humble but truly great men and women who cherished their national heritage and passed it on in trust to us. For the sake of understanding, identity and unity in this country in these troubled times. For the sake of joy and beauty in generations to come. For the sake of truth and of learning. For the sake of everything you hold dear, noble and holy. Do not let us down in our work.